Hello besties, welcome back to my channel. About a year ago on my channel I did a video called Bestie TBR SWAP where me and my bestie Kiva gave each other 4 books to read. We swapped books. We basically just did a book swap. We gave each other books to read. It's a pretty self-explanatory video. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to go watch that. But I realized I haven't done my video talking about all of the books that Kiva gave me to read and my thoughts and opinions on them. And I thought this would be a perfect time to upload this video because it's Kiva's birthday. Well, if it's not Kiva's birthday, just ignore this. But if it is, hi Kiva, happy birthday. Hopefully this does go up on your birthday and you get to hear my thoughts and opinions on these books that you very kindly gave me. I'm pretty sure, I don't actually know if Kiva's read all of the books that I gave him. I know that he's definitely read most of them and I'm pretty sure he's talked about a bunch of them in like some reading wrap-ups that he's uploaded. I'll find the videos. I will link them down in the description as well if you want to hear what Kiva's opinions on the books that I gave him were. But Kiva gave me a great variety of books to read. I just finished the last one that Kiva gave me literally yesterday. So now that I've finished all of them, let's talk about them. The first one that I read that Kiva gave me, which I think probably was the most important book that Kiva gave me because this is one of his favorites, and that is Bloody Rose by Eames. Not all of the books that Kiva gave me were like favorites of his, but this one definitely is a favorite. And I'm not gonna lie, I was really scared going into this that I wasn't gonna like it and I was going to have to sit here and kind of rag on one of Kiva's favorite books, but I absolutely loved this. This was really great. I was a little worried going into this, not only because it was Kiva's favorite, but also because it's a fantasy and I haven't read like a high adult kind of fantasy, epic fantasy book like this in a really long time. And also when Kiva was describing this book to me, he described it as a book that people who like D&D will like, and I'm not a D&D kind of person. For anyone who doesn't know, D&D is Dungeons and Dragons, which is a storytelling based game. Honestly, in theory, it's everything I really should love, but I don't. Games stress me out, so I'm not like a huge game fan, but the little that I know about D&D, I can definitely see how this is very D&D-esque. This book is set in a fantasy world where there are a whole bunch of monsters and things that exist, and then there are groups of people who go off and fight these monsters. And this book follows Tam, who lives in like just a small village. She's a bartender. Tam's kind of just lived a very quiet, normal life up until a bunch of bands come through her town, and essentially she ends up getting recruited into the arguably most famous band of their time called Fable. She auditions to be their bard. So the group is consisted of 4 people, Bloody Rose being the leader and the most famous of, I think she's arguably like the most famous mercenary currently. Like she is so famous. Everyone loves Bloody Rose. There is also a druid in their group. There is an ink witch and also a kind of like shapeshifter guy. He can turn into a bear. So these group of people, they travel around and fight monsters. Tam joins them and they go on a whole bunch of adventures. And I really liked this. It was really good. The writing style was really funny. And New Zealand has a very specific kind of humor, I will say, and I found Eames' writing to be very similar to a lot of New Zealand humor. But as I said, I was kind of scared going into this because I haven't read a really epic high fantasy in a while, but this was surprisingly very easy to read and very easy to get into because every chapter almost felt like a mini fantasy story in and of its own. But obviously you follow the same characters and everything, so it is one continuous book, but the chapters were just so well written, so concise, that it was just so easy to get into, so easy to follow along. And this was so epic. When Kiva gave this to me, Kiva was like, it's super epic, there are dragons, there is lesbian relationships, really strong female characters, and they had all of these things, and I absolutely loved every single part of it. And I was honestly surprised by how much I enjoyed all of those things, because sometimes with fantasy, there are things that can be included in fantasy books, but they sometimes are not as important in comparison to the fantasy aspect of the story, if that makes sense. Sometimes the epicness of the fantasy can take over everything else. But there were some really epic romances in this, definitely queer representation. I think my favorite character was Kara, the ink witch. She was so cool. She was so insanely cool. Just like a little bit obsessed with her. Also, Bloody Rose surprised me constantly. At the start of the story, she's this idolized kind of war hero, epic fighter of fantasies, but just the more that you learn about her, the more interesting she gets. And listen, people rag on male writers for not writing good female characters, but Nicholas Eames really fucking nailed it with Bloody Rose. All of the characters in this were incredible, every single one. I will say maybe the character that I liked the least would be the overall main antagonist of the story, who doesn't really come into play into the last half of the story, so I'm not going to say who it is, because you kind of have to, it's a kind of a mystery to figure out who the overall villain is, so I won't spoil anything. But I will say the main antagonist kind of is a little bit of a cliche, and I would say that they were the only one character who I really felt was just kind of like a little bit stereotypical, not as amazingly written as all of the others. But even then, like, the antagonist wasn't a bad character. The antagonist was really good. You really understood the antagonist. I'm not saying that Nicholas Eames didn't write the antagonist well. I'm just saying probably just the least interesting character, I guess. But even then, I guess you could say that the lack of character development for the antagonist could be made up of by the mystery surrounding who the antagonist is for most of the story. It wasn't really like a mind-boggling mystery. Like, this plot it was pretty predictable. I was able to predict everything that happened in this. It was very clear where the story was going at all times, which some people don't like when books are predictable, but in a book like this, it's honestly a sign of a really good story. And I mean, like, the predictability wasn't like I read the first few chapters and knew exactly where the story was going to go, but you could definitely pick up on bits and pieces and realize where the story was going to go a few chapters in advance, which honestly was just like really fun, because I would just get really excited for the next few chapters. I genuinely could not put this book down. It was really, really good. And I'm considering reading Kings of the Wild, which is in the same universe, but I think it is about Bloody Rose's dad, who's also a legendary mercenary fighter, because this was really fun and I really liked this. And I think Nicholas Eames is an incredible fantasy writer, which, wow, I genuinely haven't read a fantasy that hasn't been written by a woman that I've loved in so long. So this was a very nice surprise, and I'm just really glad that I loved Kiva's favorite book. One of Kiva's favorite books. The favorite book that Kiva gave me out of all of these books. I liked it, and I'm really glad. I can see why Kiva loves her so much. There were two books that Kiva gave me that I wasn't sure if I was actually going to enjoy. I was worried about not liking Bloody Rose just because Kiva loved it so much, but generally I do like fantasy, so I thought if I didn't love it, I would at least like it. But I was really uncertain about two of the books that Kiva gave me for different reasons. We'll talk about the one that surprised me the most, which was The Universe versus Alex Woods by Gavin Extence, which is a YA book, and I haven't read YA in a very long time, and this was probably my main concern going into this. And so I thought this was going to be the book that I probably liked the least. Not that I was expecting to dislike it, I just thought it wouldn't be as interesting as all the others. Don't know why I doubted Kiva. This was really great. I actually cried while reading this, which if I had to have guessed what book I would have cried in, well, like, out of these four books that Kiva gave me, this is definitely not the book that I would have picked. This is about Alex Woods, who's just a kind of average kid. He lives with his mom, who's a little bit quirky, a little bit different. She's a psychic. She owns her own shop where she does tarot readings for people and sells a whole lot of psychic related things, like crystals and stuff like that. So people think Alex's mom is kind of weird, and I guess by association they kind of think Alex is a little bit weird as well. And then when Alex is 10, a meteor crashes through the roof of his bathroom and hits him on the head, sends him into a 2-week coma, and he gets epilepsy. When he wakes up, he's kind of famous because, like, oh my god, he got hit in the head by a meteor and he survived. He's lived. But he lives in a very small town. Everyone kind of is aware of who he is. Alex, having to deal with his epilepsy, ends up living at home for about a year and a bit, just to like learn how to live with epilepsy. But after a while he just goes back to school, but he really doesn't fit in. He's bullied. One bullying incident, which happens outside of school, leads him to hiding in some random old guy's shed in his town. The bullies are outside, they're trying to get in, they break some of the windows of the shed, whatever, they leave eventually. But this old guy is obviously upset because his shed's broken, and obviously Alex is the one that he finds because Alex is locked inside. And so Alex is like, I will help you out on the weekends to make up for the fact that I broke your window, and this leads to Alex and the old man becoming really good friends, and Alex is also other friends with this goth emo girl at a school who's like a year or so older than him, who really likes Alex and his mum and wants to work in the psychic shop with Alex's mum. And all of the relationships that Alex has in this book were really touching. Surprisingly very emotional book, especially the relationship between Alex and the old guy. His name is Mr. Peterson. The friendship between Alex and Mr. Peterson was a little bit strange for sure, but really, really sweet. And the end of this book was just so bittersweet, in the most bittersweet way possible, and I did cry. The story is told, so at the very start of the book, like the very first chapter, you see Alex getting pulled over by the police, and they find a bunch of weed in his car and the ashes of a dead guy in this like passenger seat. The very classic record scratch freeze frame. You're probably wondering how I got here. Very classic YA kind of storytelling, but the story was surprising in every single way. I really liked this. In saying that though, the other book that I was kind of worried about reading, and is probably the book that I liked the least, like if I had to rate these, would be Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton. And I was nervous going into this because this is gonna sound so terrible, but this is a book written by an Australian author set in Australia. And I don't know what it is, but books written by or set in New Zealand and Australia are just not, I've never really found one that I've really enjoyed. There's something about them, they're just like not great. And so while I liked this book, I was surprised by how much I liked this book, seeing as I really thought I wouldn't like it. But I would say it's probably one of the best like Australian, New Zealand written books that I have ever read. And so when Kiva gave me this book, Kiva didn't really want to tell me too much about what it's about because he didn't want to spoil anything. And after reading this, I understand where he was coming from. So this book is set in Australia, in Brisbane, in 1985, and the blurb on the back, I'll just read it to you. I think it's the best summary of the story. Boy Swallows Universe is about a lost father, a mute brother, a junkie mum, a heroin dealer for a stepfather, and a notorious crim for a babysitter. It's not as if Eli Bell's life isn't complicated enough already. He's just trying to follow his heart and understand what it means to be a good man, but fate keeps throwing obstacles in his way, not the least of which is Titus Brus, legendary Brisbane drug dealer. But now Eli's life is going to get a whole lot more serious. He's about to meet the father that he doesn't remember, break into Boggo Road Gaol on Christmas Day, which is a prison, to rescue his mum, come face to face with the criminals who tore his world apart, and fall in love with the girl of his dreams. And I honestly wish I had read the back of this book before I read it, because this is very much a kind of crime mystery story, which I don't know why, I just really was not expecting that. I guess because Eli Bell, in the start of the story, he's a very young child, and so I was kind of just thinking, I was like, oh, this is just going to be kind of a classic coming of age sort of story, not YA, but one of those adult books that looks at the struggles of a young kid's life, right? Which, yes, that is kind of what this book is, but it's also very much a crime mystery story written in such an interesting way. When Kiva gave this to me, Kiva said that he really liked the writing style, and I agree. It's a writing style that I have a very weird kind of relationship with, because this writing style is very much the type of writing style that I would have used in a creative writing class if I wanted to get an A. It's poetic, it's flowery, it's descriptive, but sometimes when books have that sort of very flowery sort of voice, have that flowery voice and are really descriptive, it sometimes is too descriptive and it doesn't give you room to think about what you're reading and form your kind of own opinions. But I guess it's just not as satisfying reading that, I guess, compared to Alex Wood's versus the Universe, where the writing is very basic, simple. Like, there were parts when I was reading this and I was like, this is actually very poignant. Like, despite the very simple writing, this is a very big thing or a very big emotion that is being described, and it kind of hits you harder when it's not as clearly stated, I guess. Sometimes it's just a little bit suffocating reading books like this. Kiva did say that it took him a while to get into this. I honestly did not find that. I think I read this book the quickest out of all of them. Like, Bloody Rose was fun and I couldn't put it down, but I flew through this. I think I read this in like 2-3 hours, and this is like a 500-page book, which is great because, as I said, I thought I wasn't gonna like this book at all. I obviously did enjoy it. Definitely took me by surprise. As I said, I wish I had read the blurb, but also I think The fact that it took me by surprise adds to me liking it. I don't know if I would have liked it as much if I had known going into it what it was going to be about. I think my favorite thing about this would be the fantastical way in which Trent Dalton talks about the trauma that these boys go through, and not in like, it's not the way that he describes the trauma itself, but the after effects. The way that he shows how these young kids are affected by all of the traumatic stuff that happens to them. And while I was reading this book, I genuinely couldn't tell if this was a magical realism or not, because there is this kind of fantastical aspect to it, but it's not fantasy. There is no magic, but that is just the way that these boys, that they think that the world works after they've gone through all of this trauma. It was a very beautiful way of showing how an innocent young child goes through something horrific. The way that he described it, he kept that beautiful innocence. It was really well done. It was a really great book. I can see why this won so many awards. I don't know if you can see, but there are just like stickers on this cover, and you know what? It makes sense. I think if anyone hasn't read any like Australia, New Zealand books before, this is probably one of the best books you could pick up, because a lot of New Zealand, Australian books honestly do deal with a lot of like serious issues like this, but I don't know if they ever write it as well as Trent Dalton did. Also very interesting, this book is sort of autobiographical in a sense. Trent Dalton based the story on things that happened to him as a child, and it's not like absolutely his childhood all in this book, but he obviously grew up in the area and I would assume went through some or similar experience to what Eli and his brother go through in this book. So that was a very interesting thing to learn about. So overall, I really liked this. I really did. It was gorgeous, but it's probably just my least. I feel like I won't remember this one as much as I will remember the other ones, because it didn't really get to me emotionally as much, but still like just really good. I would recommend this to people, but it's obviously just not really like my personal taste in literature. But I'm really glad that Kiva gave this to me, because otherwise I definitely would have never picked it up. And like that was kind of the point of this whole book swap. We were trying to give books that we would like, but also books that we wouldn't, that were a little bit different to what we usually read. And the last book that Kiva gave me is definitely one of the most interesting books that I've ever read, and it's very different. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, specifically memoirs or anything like that, but the last book Kiva gave me was In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park, and Yeonmi Park was a North Korean who escaped to China and got caught up in human trafficking at a very young age, escaped China to South Korea, and then went on to become an advocate for human rights, North Korean rights, and human trafficking and all this sort of stuff. When Kiva gave this to me and Kiva told me what this was about, I was like, yeah, this book is going to make me cry. And it did. This book is so upsetting. Reading everything that Yeonmi Park experienced as a child, as a 13-year-old girl, horrifying. Absolutely traumatizing, which is exactly what Yeonmi Park is like wanting people to know, is what it was truly like living in North Korea, because obviously North Korea is, it's its own thing. No one really knows what goes on in there. I mean, we know a bit more now, but no one really knew what was going on in North Korea. Everyone in North Korea didn't know what was going on in the rest of the world. And so not only was this a really interesting book to read, I feel like it was very important, and I'm really glad that I've read this. Like genuinely, I don't know how you could read a memo like this and forget it ever. And I found it interesting because obviously all of the things that Yeonmi Park goes through as a child in North Korea and then in China, dealing with human trafficking and things like that, obviously that is all like objectively horrific, but it was towards the end of the book where Yeonmi Park was settling into a normal life in South Korea, where I felt like so upset reading this, where Yeonmi Park was like learning to tell her story and realized that she could tell people these things and that they empathize with her, sympathize for her, and actually want to hear her story. And when she realized that she had a voice and people wanted to hear what was going on and she could advocate for people in North Korea, I think that genuinely just got to me so much. just cried so much reading this. And that's not to say that everything else that happens in the book isn't. I cried multiple times reading this. This book is separated into 3 parts. So there's the part where Yeonmi Park lived in North Korea, her childhood, everything leading up to her escape. And then the second part of this book is set in China, which is all about Yeonmi Park's dealing with human trafficking. And then the third part of this book is set in South Korea when Yeonmi Park escaped China, got out of the human trafficking, started her new life with her mum in South Korea. Like, I genuinely think everyone should read this, but also there is so much like content that I understand is so triggering for people, and I can't tell if it's like less triggering or more triggering because it's real. I don't know if that makes any sense, but sometimes like when you're reading fiction and there's triggering content, you know, sometimes it's just kind of a bit nasty because you're like, you didn't have to put that in there. Like, why did you put that in there? And so it's shocking in how triggering it is. Whereas with this, you know exactly what you're going into, and it's just everything that happened to her. And so it's not triggering in that sense, but obviously it's just, there's a lot of very upsetting content in this book. Not only Yeonmi Park, but just obviously everyone that she knew in her life. Genuinely, I think one of the reviews in the front of the book says that, you know, what an amazing strength of character that everybody that Yeonmi Park talks about having. Just like absolutely, the strength of everyone that Yeonmi Park talks about is so incredible. Someone said, I don't know if I would call this book inspiring. A lot of people have said that Yeonmi Park is really inspiring, and I suppose that she is. She's gone through so much and she's persevered. I just feel like inspiring is maybe like the wrong word. I don't know, it's hard for me to review non-fiction because I don't read a lot of it, but I won't forget reading this. This was an experience, which I'm really glad that I read, because it was really, I think when Kiva gave this to me, Kiva was like, it's so well written, and it is so well written for something that obviously would have been so incredibly hard to write about. Yeonmi Park did an incredible job writing this and speaking out about everything. Like a really incredible book. And absolutely, like, I'm not saying I would have never picked this up, but because I don't read a lot of nonfiction and not a lot of memoirs and things like that, it probably would have taken me a very long time to get to this or find out about this if Kiva hadn't given this to me. So definitely read a bunch of books that I normally wouldn't have read thanks to Kiva. All of these books are so different and they were all really, really good. And I would say that this was a huge success, this TBR swap. I know Kiva had somewhat mixed opinions about some of the books, but overall I would say good opinions, good thoughts and feelings on the books that I gave him, and I would say the same for me. Overall, really great experience reading all of these books. Kiva, if you're watching this, thank you so much for doing this with me, for swapping books with me, for giving me these amazing books to read. I haven't told Kiva that I'm making this video because I wanted it to be like a little bit of a surprise, but I am, like, immediately now that I've finished filming this, I'm now going to go and tell Kiva that I've read all of these and talk to Kiva about it. But also, this is my video for Kiva, talking about all the books I read. This video is for you, Kiva. This video is dedicated to you. But also, if you're just watching this, if you're watching a video on my channel, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I had so much fun doing this. I would genuinely love to do this with other friends of mine. I have a few people in mind. I have friends who I could do this with. I don't know if we could do the swap, the physical swapping of the books as I did with Kiva, but I do love the idea of reading books that my friends enjoy or recommend to me, just to see if they have a different taste to me and things like that. This is a lot of fun, and these are usually my favorite kind of videos to watch on YouTube, when people like try reading different books to what they usually would just pick up on their own. So I hope, if you're just watching this randomly, I hope you enjoyed this, to pick up some of Kiva's recommendations. I mean, I would recommend all of these as well, so there you go. But I will see you guys with another video sometime really, really soon. Bye, besties.